Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the intricacies of diplomacy and law in peace processes. I am your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. This is episode 2 of our two-part interview with Ambassador Robert Ford. In the first part of our fascinating discussion, Ambassador Ford shared details of his service as the Deputy U.S. Ambassador to Iraq and reflected on the challenges he encountered and the lessons learned in post-conflict state building in Iraq. Now, in this episode, we will dive into a discussion with Ambassador Ford regarding his time as the former U.S. Ambassador to Syria, where he was the Department of State's lead on Syria's peace process, developing policies and strategies with European and Middle Eastern allies in support of resolving the Syrian conflict. Let's kick it off now with the first question. Well, Robert, let's pivot to 2011, where you became the U.S. ambassador to Syria. There was the Arab Spring. Assad reacted in a very hostile manner to anybody, youth, women, children, men who were seeking some type of democratic transition, Arab Spring. You played a very key role, as our listeners know, in projecting American affinity and closeness with those who were seeking to move Syria into democracy. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And then we'll move into the Geneva peace process.
Yeah, we didn't see until right before it started that Syria was going to blow. Egypt and Tunisia and Yemen and Bahrain had already started. President Mubarak and President Ben Ali of Tunisia had already fled their seats before the Syrian revolution started. But in my first meeting with President Assad in January of 2011, I was trying to figure out how to ask him if he was nervous that his country would erupt in the same way that Tunisia, Egypt, and Bahrain had done. But I thought, well, I can't just ask him that directly. That would be pretty rude for a new ambassador. So I said, well, there are a lot of hot winds blowing in North Africa. Are you worried they're going to get here? I thought that was about as diplomatically as I could put it. And he understood exactly what I was saying. And he said, nope, won't ever happen here. Syrian people support me because we lead the axis of resistance against Israel. About 10 days after that conversation, the first protest in Damascus started, down in downtown Damascus. This is before the bigger protests in a city called Daraa down on the Jordanian border in March. And this protest in Damascus was all of about 2 miles from our embassy, but we didn't even know that it was going on. And somebody called one of our political officers, one of his contacts, Syrian contact, and said, you might want to get on YouTube and look at what happened this afternoon in downtown Damascus. Type in this. And remember, the young political officer came and got me out of my office, the ambassador office. He said, Mr. Ambassador, could you come down to my computer and look at something? I'm like, whoa, this is like serious stuff. So we sent a note to Washington. We said, it's coming. We don't know exactly when it's going to get here, but it's going to get here and it's coming and it's going to be big. The last line in the report to Washington, I remember I put it in, is the tinder is very dry and it's gonna ignite soon. So, and it did about 3 weeks later. I would emphasize here to listeners that embassies should not take sides politically. It's not any embassy's job to favor a particular political politician or party or faction or anything like that. We broke that rule constantly in Iraq, and we always made things worse in Iraq when we did that. That's how Nouri al-Maliki became prime minister again in Iraq in 2011 because the Americans weighed in. That decision, which came, frankly, from the Oval Office and the vice president at the time, ended up creating ISIS. That was the single biggest thing that created ISIS, not the withdrawal of American forces, the return of Nouri al-Maliki and his sectarian politics to Iraq. So from the beginning, I insisted we were not going to back any party. We're not going to back any faction. We were going to back principles. So, for example, and most important in the situation of Syria, the right to assemble peacefully, which is actually enshrined in the United Nations Charter of Universal Human Rights, which Eleanor Roosevelt helped draft after the Second World War, and to which the government of Syria acceded in the 1950s. We've supported, for example, freedom of speech, which also is enshrined in that United Nations Universal Human Rights Charter. So we backed principles, and we also called for nonviolence. And I wanted nonviolence because I'd already been through a civil war in Algeria in the 1990s and then the Iraq experience. And the last thing that we wanted to see was that kind of killing in a place like Syria. So we also pushed very hard for nonviolence. That American policy changed a bit in 2012 and not in a well thought out way. In fact, in a very poorly thought out way, little thought out way. But initially, that was our approach, that there should be respect for these universal human rights, peaceful assembly, freedom of speech, and of course, don't arrest people and hold them and torture them, etc., kill them, and that the two sides, government and the opposition, should have a dialogue. We didn't even say negotiation initially. We just said they need to have discussions and it needs to be a dialogue. I remember at one point, one of the advisors to Bashar al-Assad said to me, "Well, who are they?" And I said, "Well, I don't even know exactly who they are." But I said, "You have your 4 different secret police services. You know very well who the most influential ones are. Can't you invite them over for coffee or tea?" Does that sound a bit like what we were saying in Iraq? Yes. And just have conversations with them. And at one point, at my urging and that of my British and French colleagues, the 3 of us went in together and had several meetings with Syrian officials. We finally got them to agree to do a kind of a broad dialogue. This was in June of 2011. Yes, June of 2011, where they would invite a variety of people from the protest movement and opposition, and there had been an opposition, often jailed, and just start a dialogue. And the night before it was supposed to start, the secret police came and raided the location where the meetings were to be the next day and hauled away a whole bunch of opposition people. To this day, Paul, I don't know if that was done with the express approval of the Syrian presidency or not, but in any case, it happened. And the Syrian government made no apologies for it, and that dialogue process broke down almost instantly. That was in June. We continued to urge dialogue through the summer and into the autumn. The United Nations, well, first the Arab League, and then later the United Nations proposed a ceasefire and the start of some kind of conversations, negotiations. The Americans strongly backed all of that. We backed the dispatch of Arab League peacekeepers, an observation force, not peacekeepers. The Syrian government wouldn't accept the idea of peacekeepers, but observation force. And then later, a small United Nations observation force. That was in spring of 2012. But the violence just escalated, and our calls for nonviolence, frankly, were going nowhere.
So, Robert, how did it move from that situation then into the Geneva peace negotiations? There's a little bit of the Arab League observers, the UN observers, beginning to form a opposition in exile, and then Geneva peace talks. Walk us through that transition.
So the fundamental document that guided American policy in 2012, 13, and 14, I left government in February 2014, was the Geneva Agreement, which then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and others, Turkey, Arab League states, European states like France, Britain, they all support it. There was a big discussion in Geneva at the very end of June 2012, like a full year after that aborted meeting that I was talking about between the opposition in Damascus and the Syrian government. And And the text of that was hammered out in negotiations. It was actually largely based on a peace proposal prepared by Kofi Annan and his team from the United Nations during the spring, attached to that United Nations observer mission, which was withdrawn because there was constant eruptions of fighting and the UN observer force had no mandate to intervene in the fighting. And the Norwegian commander finally just said, "We need to pull out of this. We're ineffective and we're endangering ourselves and we're not doing anything." So, which they did. But the Annan peace plan remained. And key element of that peace plan was that the Syrian government and the Syrian opposition would negotiate a transition governing body with full executive authority, and that the government, this transition governing body, would be formed with unanimous consent. That is to say, government would have its negotiations and a veto, and the opposition would have its input, and it too would have a veto. And so the American policy, the Obama administration policy after that conference, was to get the two sides to negotiate that transition governing body. The Syrian opposition immediately said, well, that means Bashar al-Assad has to go. And Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said the same thing. That means Assad has to go. And the very day that she said that, which was the day after the agreement was concluded on July 1st, the Russian foreign minister quickly held his own press conference and said, under no circumstances does the Geneva communique require that Bashar al-Assad step down. There has to be a negotiation. I have to say, Lavrov was right. It had to be by unanimous consent. So for us, it was a sort of a two-stage operation. We had a meeting at the United Nations with this sharp disagreement between the Russians and the Americans. There was very little progress moving towards the convening under the United Nations of peace talks between the Syrian government and the Syrian opposition. And the rest of 2012 sort of petered out. Fighting is escalating all over Syria by this time, and there are large numbers of casualties on both sides. Every week, hundreds of Syrians are being killed, both people fighting and civilians. And it's very nasty. 2012 closes. The Americans have their election. Barack Obama is reelected. And there's a new Secretary of State, John Kerry. And John Kerry's very first meeting as Secretary of State was in his office with us, the Syria team. Assistant Secretary for Near East Affairs, Beth Jones, and I went up to his office. I remember that Secretary Kerry's dog was running around the meeting table, and I had never seen a dog in the Secretary's suite before, ever. That was new. So, and John Kerry wanted to re-energize the effort to get to a negotiation between the Syrian opposition and the Syrian government. So we told him that we needed to support the Syrian opposition more materially so that they could build their own credibility on the ground in Syria. Already there were problems of lack of medical supplies, lack of food, and that the Syrian opposition needed to somehow make itself able to be involved in that so that they could build their own grassroots. At the same time, we needed to get with the Russians and sort of agree that the conference needed to be convened. The United Nations wanted to do it, but there was no agreement in the Security Council on moving forward. So John Kerry visited Moscow in April of 2013, and they did agree to reconvene the conference, and they set a target date for fall of 2013. Kerry and Lavrov had sort of agreed that the Russians would be responsible for getting the very reluctant government of Bashar al-Assad to attend the negotiations, and we, the Americans, would be responsible for getting the Syrian opposition to the table. Syrian opposition in 2013 was very fragmented, both politically and in terms of the military fighters, dozens and dozens of groups. Some people have said there were thousands. There were not thousands. There were essentially maybe a dozen that really mattered. But some of them were hardline Islamist factions, and it was going to be a problem to get them to come to peace talks. So my team spent much of 2013, making repeated trips to Turkey, occasionally to Jordan and other regional capitals like Riyadh. We also went to Paris because the French were involved with the Syrian opposition too. Trying to do two things. Number one, get them to agree to negotiate under the Geneva Communique, which meant that they couldn't just say Bashar al-Assad has to go and they would impose a transition governing body. There's going to have to be a negotiation and some compromise. And when they would squint at me and say, you like Bashar al-Assad, I'd say, I didn't say that. I totally understand that you want to get rid of Bashar al-Assad, but you are not going to get 100% of what you want. So you need to start thinking about your priorities. What's the most important thing to you? What's the second most important thing? What's the third most important thing? You decide, but you will have to make compromises somewhere. Not a message that people involved in fighting a vicious, despotic dictatorship wanted to hear. In fact, in early 2013, they actually thought they might win a military victory, and we had to temper those expectations too and said, not so clear you're going to win militarily. Second thing we had to do was to get the armed factions to buy off on some kind of delegation going to Geneva and actually negotiating. And that was extremely difficult. We had to get the Turks on board. The Turks were very skeptical of the negotiations. The Qataris, who were also heavily involved in arming the opposition, especially in the northern part of the country, the Qataris were more supple about it and said, well, yeah, you go ahead. It's not going to stop us sending in arms. But yeah, give it your all. We'll be helpful. We'll tell them they have to go. We had a meeting in Ban Ki-moon's office. Secretary Kerry and I went in and talked to the UN Secretary General with the foreign ministers of other countries to sort of give him a progress report. This was in August of 2013. And we told the Secretary General that we were making some progress with the Syrian opposition, but it was difficult, that there were a lot of holdouts against coming to any kind of a negotiation, and the armed groups were still going to be a problem. Remember, Ban Ki-moon looked at me and said, Mr. Ambassador, you just have to get them there. And I said, well, we're going to need a lot of help from other countries too. So during the fall of 2013, we finally got the Syrian political side to agree to go to talks. Not that they had a plan, although I think, Paul, by then you were involved in helping them develop plans. And we still had the problem of the holdout, hardline Islamist fighting factions that rejected any negotiation. That fear of hardline rejection, which terrified the Syrian politicians, that threat hung over the entire process until the end of the year, when finally, at our urging, Turkey and Qatar had a meeting with them, their leaders in Ankara, and they laid down the line. Shut up. You don't like it, that's fine. You don't have to like it, but you will say nothing publicly. Turkey and Qatar essentially said, if you don't stop the public criticism, we'll shut off your arms, that's why they came to heel. So we got to Geneva. Of course, the result didn't even come close to what we were hoping for.
And tell us just a little bit about the dynamics in Geneva, why it failed, what efforts were you undertaking to manage the cohesion among the opposition, manage our Russian friends at the time and our other allies. And then I want to close with one takeaway lesson learned for future peace builders.
So with the Russians, it was fairly simple because there had been an agreed letter describing what the purpose of the negotiations was to be, the negotiation and agreement on a transition governing body with full executive authority. Language was literally drafted out of the June 2012 Geneva Communique as the talks opened in January 2014. And we just referred to that with the Russians, and the Russians said, yes, yes, yes. The Syrian opposition delegation was more cohesive, actually, than I had anticipated. Once they were there, they sort of saw, well, maybe this will work out. The war wasn't going nearly so well for them. By January 2014, Hezbollah and Iran had intervened, and there was a sort of a bloody stalemate on the ground at that time. And so they took it more seriously, and some armed factions actually did send representatives to Geneva. They weren't in the room with the Assad negotiators, but they were at the hotel and they were kept informed. And for the most part, the armed factions didn't say anything one way or the other. They just kept quiet, but that was good enough to give room for negotiations. The most remarkable thing to me, and you were involved in this, Paul, so chime in, was a proposal put on the table in writing in February 2014, where the Syrian opposition said, we do not insist. They said indirectly, they said, we do not insist that Bashar al-Assad step down. We are prepared to negotiate each single position of a transition governing body and come to an agreement with the Syrian government on each position, meaning that they would even negotiate the position of Bashar al-Assad, rather than insist as a precondition that he step aside. That's a huge change. And when the United Nations Special Envoy, Lakhdar Brahimi, saw that, he was very pleased because he thought this opens up, in a new way, getting to a negotiation. But the Syrian government refused to negotiate a transition governing body, even though they had accepted the invitation with the clearly laid out stipulation that that was the point of the negotiation. Once they were actually in the room at the table, they said, we're not going to negotiate it. They were only prepared to negotiate security measures that the opposition would agree to fight what the Syrian government called terrorism, which is essentially anybody fighting the Syrian army. So when we got stuck, with Secretary Kerry's permission, I went to the Syrian opposition and said, we could still do two tracks. You can have a track to talk about security, and you have your own security concerns, barrel bombs, chemical weapons attacks, which we were already seeing. There'd been the big one in suburban Damascus in August of 2013. You have your own security issues you can raise in those kind of talks. It's security track, I call it. But there can be a political track that runs at the same time. That was an overnight argument because the letter from the United Nations from September 2013 said nothing about two tracks. It just said negotiate a transition governing body. So this was already outside the terms of the letter that they had accepted, painfully. And it took all night to get them to agree to it. But they did, including the armed factions. When we went the next day to the Russians to say, here's the proposal, the Syrian opposition is willing to do it, but this will require the Syrian government to not only talk about security, but also to talk about the transition governing body. And the deputy Russian foreign minister said, "Niet." And we said, well, wait, are you saying you're not going to put any pressure on the Syrian government to accept these two tracks? We are still negotiating security as well as transition governing body. And they said, nope, we will put no pressure on the Syrian government. If they reject it, we said, well, we know they'll reject it. They said, well, then we're not going to put pressure on them. And then U.S. Department of State Undersecretary for Political Affairs, the number 3 person of the State Department, is a woman named Wendy Sherman, who's later to negotiate the deal with Iran on the nuclear. Wendy, who was one of the toughest people I ever met in U.S. government, I adore her for her toughness. She just laid into the Russians and said, we have been working on this for a year, and you have agreed to get the government to talk about a transition governing body. And now you are saying you will do nothing after all of the agreements we have had? You are walking back everything. What does that say about your credibility? She slammed him really hard. The Niet didn't change, and we left Geneva the next day. That was the end. And I tendered my resignation 2 weeks later.
Well,
Yeah.
let's leave our listeners with one takeaway, either in the design and structure of a process or in efforts to build cohesion among an opposition coalition, or how to overcome Niet. Pick whichever one you want and leave us with a takeaway.
I don't think you can always overcome a Niet. Sometimes the disagreements are just too sharp, especially if one side has a military advantage. And that certainly was the case in Syria, where by 2014, Assad was clearly not going to be overthrown by force, and the Russians knew it. So their incentive to compromise was less in 2014 than it had been, say, in 2012. I'm more interested in talking about how to build coalitions, which we had to do in Iraq in terms of assembling a government, cabinet, and also we had to do with the Syrian opposition. And I have a couple of takeaways from that. Number one, having big meetings to do that kind of thing technically is it looks appealing, like let's get everybody in a room and we'll hash it out. Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong approach. Needs to be very small at the start and you build out. And that can take a long time, especially when you're in a civil war situation and fear and mistrust are running very high. And it may be that you don't ever get anybody in the same room, at least at the start, for a long time. But the mediator, whoever it is literally shuttling back and forth. There's no harm in shuttle diplomacy. In fact, in many cases, I think it's easier and more efficient in terms of time and in terms of making progress. Build out with a coalition, focus initially on very general ideas and hone them down. That worked especially well with the Syrians. With the Iraqis, they were shrewder than that in some ways. They were more experienced political negotiators, and they quickly wanted to talk about specific short-term details. But the Syrians eventually did get there, but not until just before the negotiations in Geneva started. Negotiations quickly fell apart anyway. So I wouldn't blame the Syrian opposition for that, though. I'd blame the Syrian government. So last thing is, especially when you're in the process of building coalitions and you're starting small, you want to keep it kind of quiet because you're asking people to compromise. They may not be in a position to make public that they're compromising right away. They have to do their own, how would I say it, base of support reinforcement. And you can help that maybe, but sometimes you need to stay out of it so that it doesn't look like they are doing something subject to outside pressure, but rather they're doing it because they see a short-term tactical advantage for their own group and they want to explain that. So requires a level of frankness with the people you're negotiating with. Doesn't mean you have to put all the cards on the table, but you have to put some cards on the table. And maybe the most important thing of all, I don't want to forget to emphasize this. You must, when you make a commitment to do something, you must do it. If for some reason you can't do it, don't surprise them when you can't do it. You have to talk to them and say, something awful has come up and I cannot control it. And this is what it is. And this is why we're doing what we have to do. And I wanted to tell you ahead of time. And that needs to be done very privately and help them manage the fallout. I frequently saw the Americans make promises in places like Iraq and Syria that we did not keep, and it hurt our own credibility.
Well, Robert, thank you for those three takeaways. Those are hugely valuable lessons for future peace builders to bear in mind as they try to replicate your success or avoid some of your failures. So it's good to have.
In no circumstance can anyone say Syria was a success.
So they can avoid some of those pitfalls. Well, Robert, it's been a real honor and privilege to have this conversation with you. You've been so generous with your time today. But I also remember in Geneva when I and the PLPG team were providing legal support for the Syrian opposition. You were very generous with your time with us, helping to share your insights as to how we could do or be most effective at advising them. And you were very inclusive of our people and our thoughts and ideas. And I remember how much the Syrian opposition respected you and your team, and that you were frank with them and that you honored your word. So thank you again for chatting with us, and thank you for all the great work that you did in Iraq and that you tried to do in Syria.
Yeah, well, it was nice speaking with you, Paul.